dark cherry tart clung stubbornly to $3,000 worth of pristine, custom Italian wool. Beside the wreckage stood my 4-year-old son, proudly holding an empty plate with a massive grin. Bracing myself for the billionaire's wrath, expecting him to scream, fire me, and completely ruin my life. I watched in shock as he dropped to his knees with an impossible request. The catering kitchen of the St. Regis smelled of panic sweat, scorched sugar, and white truffle oil. It was 8:30 on a Friday night, the peak of the annual Davies Foundation Gala. Out there, beyond the brass-studded swinging doors, were the people who owned the city. In here were the people who scrubbed it. I fell firmly into the second category. My name is Holly. I was 28, chronically underslept, and holding on to my job at Elite Event Staffing by the skin of my teeth. My uniform collar was too tight. My cheap flats were digging into my heels. And my 4-year-old son, Levo, was currently sitting under the prep stainless steel counter, coloring a picture of a dinosaur on the back of a discarded menu. He wasn't supposed to be here, obviously. But Mrs. Gable, my downstairs neighbor who usually watched him for $10 an hour, had slipped on the ice that morning and broken her wrist. Daycare drop-ins cost more than my entire shift would pay. So I smuggled him in through the loading dock. I gave him a juice box, a pack of crayons, and strict instructions to pretend he was invisible. For 3 hours, it worked. Then came the dessert rush. Table 4 needs the tartlets. Gregory, the floor manager, snapped his fingers in my face. His forehead was slick with grease. Move it, Holly. If you drop a single one of those microgreens, you're paying for it. I grabbed the heavy silver tray. I balanced it on my palm, took a deep breath, and pushed through the swinging doors. The ballroom was a sea of velvet, diamonds, and forced laughter. The air conditioning was cranked so high my sweat instantly chilled on the back of my neck. I kept my eyes down, navigating the maze of chairs and trailing gowns. Invisible. That was the rule for the staff, too. You serve the food, you pour the wine, and you cease to exist. I made it to table 4. I leaned in, expertly sliding a cherry compote tartlet in front of a woman wearing a necklace that could pay off my student loans. Then I heard it. A high-pitched, unmistakable giggle. My stomach dropped into my shoes. I spun around. Levo wasn't under the prep counter. He was in the ballroom. He had managed to push through the heavy doors and was now weaving through the crowd, clutching a half-eaten cherry tart he must have swiped from the plating station. He was completely oblivious to the wealth around him. He was just a little boy in faded corduroys and a worn-out Spider-Man t-shirt, hunting for his mother. "Levo," I hissed, abandoning the tray on the nearest empty stand. I scrambled toward him, dodging a waiter carrying a tray of champagne. But I was too late. A man stepped back from a circle of laughing executives. He didn't look where he was going. Levo didn't look where he was running. They collided. It wasn't a soft bump. It was a hard, jarring impact. Levo bounced off the man's leg and landed flat on his bottom. The man stumbled, and the cherry tart, a sticky, dark crimson mess of pastry and fruit syrup, slapped directly onto the man's thigh, sliding down the pristine charcoal fabric of his suit before dropping to the carpet. Silence rippled outward from the collision. It killed the conversation in a 5-foot radius. I froze. The man slowly looked down at his leg. A massive, sticky red smear ruined the line of his trousers. Then, he looked down at the boy sitting on the floor. I knew who he was. Everyone in that room knew who it was. Arvon Bennett, 30-something, founder of a tech conglomerate that had just gone public. He was known for ruthlessness. He was known for firing executives in elevator rides. He didn't look angry exactly. He looked like a machine trying to process an error code. Levo looked up at him. His lower lip began to tremble. My paralysis broke. I lunged forward, falling to my knees on the thick Persian rug between my son and the billionaire. "I am so sorry," I blurted out, my voice too loud, too raw for the elegant room. I grabbed a cloth napkin from an abandoned table and frantically began to dab at the fabric of his trousers. "I'm sorry." He slipped away from me. "I'll pay for the dry cleaning. I'll pay for the suit." It was a stupid thing to say. I had $12 in my checking account. Arvon Bennett looked down at me. His eyes were a pale, striking gray. They were exhausted. "Stop," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the panic or rage I expected. "You're just rubbing it in." "I can get soda water. Club soda works on stains." "Holly," Gregory materialized out of the crowd. His face was the color of a bruised plum. He looked at the stain on Arvon Bennett's suit, then at me, and finally at Levo. Disgust twisted his features. "Mr. Bennett, my deepest apologies," Gregory groveled, his hands clasping together. "This is completely unacceptable. She is a temporary hire. I will have her removed from the premises immediately. Security." I pulled Levo against my chest. He buried his face in my neck, whimpering softly. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. Fired. Blacklisted. I'd have to pawn my laptop to make rent on Tuesday. The cynical, exhausted part of my brain just wanted to curl up on the floor and let them sweep me away with the trash. "Security isn't necessary," Arvon said. He didn't look at Gregory. He kept his eyes on me, on the white-knuckle grip I had on my son. "Sir, the boy shouldn't even be here. It's a massive liability." I said, "It's not necessary." Arvon's tone didn't raise in volume, but the absolute, chilling authority in it made Gregory snap his mouth shut. Arvon looked back down at his ruined trousers. He let out a slow, measured breath. Then, to the shock of the entire room, he squatted down. He ignored the sticky cherry syrup smearing onto his cuffs. He brought himself down to eye level with Levo. "What's your name?" Arvon asked. Levo peeked out from the crook of my neck. He sniffled. "Levo." "Well, Levo," Arvon said, pulling a pristine white linen handkerchief from his breast pocket. He held it out. "It looks like you lost your dessert." Levo stared at the handkerchief, then slowly reached out and took it, wiping his sticky hands. Arvon stood back up. He finally looked at Gregory. "Where is a quiet place, away from this music?" The manager's office, sir," Gregory stammered. "It's just down the hall." "Show us," Arvon said. He glanced down at me. "Bring the boy." The manager's office was a cramped, windowless box that smelled of stale coffee and toner. Gregory hovered by the door like an anxious moth, clearly waiting for Arvon to demand my immediate execution. "Wait outside," Arvon told him. "Close the door." "But, sir, the paperwork for the damages—" "Now." Gregory swallowed hard, backed out of the room, and the heavy door clicked shut. The sudden silence was deafening. The muffled bass from the ballroom was barely a heartbeat through the walls. I stood awkwardly by the cheap laminate desk, still holding Levo. The kid was heavy. My arms were aching, but I couldn't put him down. He felt like an anchor in a room that was suddenly spinning. Arvon didn't sit in the manager's chair. Instead, he pulled out a rickety folding chair from the corner, sat down, and stretched out his long legs. He looked utterly out of place. His suit jacket was tailored to perfection. His watch caught the fluorescent light, and yet here he was, in a glorified supply closet with cherry syrup drying on his leg. "Put him down," Arvon said, gesturing to Levo. "He's too big for you to hold like that." "He's fine," I said defensively. "Your arms are shaking." I bit my inside of my cheek. He was right. I slowly lowered Levo to the ground. Levo immediately detached himself from my leg and began inspecting a stack of copy paper boxes in the corner. I crossed my arms, trying to build a shield. "Look, Mr. Bennett, I know how this works. You're going to tell me how much the suit costs. I'll sign whatever payment plan you want. Just, please don't let Gregory call the agency. If I get a strike on my record, I can't pick up any more shifts." Arvon studied me. He didn't speak right away. He was dissecting me, piece by piece. The cheap fabric of my uniform, the dark circles under my eyes, the way I kept tracking Levo's movements. "The suit is bespoke," Arvon said quietly. "It costs roughly $6,000. The fabric is a wool silk blend. Cherry compote has a high acidic content. It will stain permanently." I felt the blood drain from my face. $6,000. That was half a year's rent. "However," Arvon continued, leaning back in the flimsy chair, "I own 7 of them in this exact shade of gray, because I hate shopping, and I hate decisions." I blinked. "I don't understand." "It means I don't care about the suit," he said. He rubbed the bridge of his nose, suddenly looking incredibly tired. The intimidating CEO facade slipped, just for a fraction of a second, revealing a man who looked like he hadn't slept a full night in a decade. "I just wanted to get out of that room." "You? Used us as an excuse to leave your own party? It's not my party. It's a foundation dinner. It's 300 people pretending they like each other while exchanging money for tax write-offs. It's exhausting." He looked at me, a genuine spark of curiosity in his gray eyes. "Why is your child at a black tie gala?" The bluntness of the question made my defenses flare up again. "Because childcare in this city costs $25 an hour, and I make 18. Because my neighbor broke her wrist, and the emergency backup sitter didn't answer her phone. Because if I miss a shift, we don't eat next week. Take your pick." I expected him to recoil. Rich people didn't like hearing about poverty. It made them uncomfortable. They preferred sanitized stories of struggle, not the gritty, ugly math of living paycheck to paycheck. But Arvon didn't flinch. "You're a single mother." "Yes." "Where is his father?" "None of your business." The words snapped out of my mouth before I could catch them. I froze, waiting for the anger. "You don't snap at a billionaire who holds your fate in his hands." A corner of Arvon's mouth twitched upward, an almost smile. "Fair enough." Levo, bored with the paper boxes, toddled over to Arvon. I tensed, ready to grab him, but Levo just stood there, staring at the sticky red stain on Arvon's leg. "I made a mess," Levo announced, his little voice echoing in the small room. "You did," Arvon agreed. "Mama says when you make a mess, you clean it up. Your mother is a wise woman, but some messes are hard to clean." "I have a fire truck," Levo offered, entirely changing the subject. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small die-cast metal fire truck. The paint was chipped. He held it out to Arvand. Arvand looked at the toy, then at Levo. He reached out and took it between his thumb and forefinger. He examined it with the same intense focus he probably used to read corporate contracts. "It has a ladder," Arvand noted. "It goes up," Levo said, demonstrating, by pushing Arvand's hand to extend the tiny plastic ladder, to save people. "I see." Arvand handed the truck back. "Thank you for showing me." I watched them, completely thrown off balance. The cynicism I used as armor was useless here. I didn't know how to navigate this. Men like Arvand Bennett didn't sit in cramped offices talking about toy fire trucks with poor kids. They sued people. They crushed people. "You're shaking," Arvand said, looking up at me. "I'm fine." "Sit down." He pointed to the desk chair. "I shouldn't. I'm supposed to be working." "If you go back out there, Gregory will fire you. If you stay in here with me, he can't touch you. I'm the most important person in this building right now, and I am choosing to hold a meeting in this office." Sit. It wasn't a request. It was an order wrapped in velvet. My legs felt like lead anyway. I sank into the manager's chair. The vinyl groaned beneath me. "What is your name?" he asked. "Holly. Holly Hayes." "Well, Holly Hayes," Arvand said, folding his hands in his lap. "Tell me about the hardest part of your day." The question caught me off guard. Not "where did you go to school?" or "what are your career goals?" but the hardest part of your day. I looked at him, really looked at him. The harsh overhead light caught the faint silver at his temples. He was handsome, but it was a cold, sharp kind of handsome. Yet right now, sitting in a plastic chair with a ruined suit, he looked softer, human. "Why do you want to know?" I asked, suspicion coloring my tone. "Because I spend my days surrounded by people who lie to me," Arvand said. "They tell me what I want to hear. They present polished problems with prepared solutions. I haven't had a genuine conversation in 6 years. Indulge me." I looked down at my hands. They were raw from the industrial dish soap they used in the prep kitchen. "The hardest part of my day," I started slowly, my voice quiet, "is the morning, when Levo wakes up. Because for the first 3 seconds, before I open my eyes, I'm just a person. But then I remember everything. I remember the electricity bill. I remember that his sneakers are getting too tight, and I don't know how I'll buy new ones. I remember that the milk is almost gone. The hardest part is opening my eyes and putting the weight back on my shoulders every single day." I didn't mean to say that much. The words just spilled out, unlocked by the sheer exhaustion I was carrying. I felt a flush of embarrassment heat my cheeks. I sounded pathetic. Arvand didn't pity me. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He just nodded, absorbing the information. "Wait," he repeated softly. "Yes. I understand weight." I scoffed. I couldn't help it. "With all due respect, Mr. Bennett, your weight comes with a golden parachute. If you fail, you lose money. If I fail, we lose our home." I expected him to bristle at the disrespect. Instead, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're right," he said. The honesty in his voice was disarming. "My survival is never in question, but my humanity is." He looked past me, staring at the blank beige wall of the office. "I built my company from a dorm room. I traded every friendship, every relationship, every hobby for equity. I won. I have more money than I could spend in 100 lifetimes. And my house is silent. I go home to an 8,000 square foot penthouse. and the only sound is the hum of the refrigerator. I have board members who need me, shareholders who track me, employees who fear me. But nobody actually wants me. Not for me. He looked back at Levo, who was now driving his fire truck over Arvon's spotless leather shoe. Then I sit in a ballroom, Arvon continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, and I watch a woman practically throw herself in front of a moving train to protect her child from a wealthy stranger. I watch a little boy who isn't afraid of the CEO, but just wants to show him a plastic truck. He looked up at me, and the intensity in his gray eyes was staggering. You fight for your son every single morning, Holly. You carry that weight because you love him. My life is weightless, and it's entirely empty. The room was silent, save for the faint vroom noises Levo was making. I didn't know what to say. The cynicism that usually protected me was failing. This wasn't a game. He wasn't mocking me. This incredibly powerful man was sitting in a dingy office, bleeding his own kind of isolation onto the floor. I'm sorry, I said, and this time I meant it. Not for the suit. For him. Arvon shook his head slightly. Don't be. It was my choice. He checked his watch, a complicated piece of machinery that probably cost more than a car. It's 9:30. His bedtime? An hour ago, I admitted. Arvon stood up. He brushed a hand over his ruined leg, unbothered. Come. Where? I asked, my anxiety spiking again. Home. I'm having my driver take you home. No, I can't do that. Gregory works for the catering company, which is currently on a year-to-year contract with the Davies Foundation, of which I am the primary board member, Arvon said. The sharp CEO tone was back, but it wasn't directed at me. It was a shield he was extending over me. Gregory is not going to say a word. You are coming with me, and you are taking your son to bed. I hesitated. Every instinct I had as a single mother screamed at me to be careful, to not trust a stranger, especially a powerful man. But I looked at Levo, whose eyes were drooping, his little head nodding as he sat on the floor. And I looked at Arvon Bennett, who was holding the door open, waiting patiently. I scooped Levo up into my arms. He immediately buried his face in my neck, fast asleep. I grabbed my cheap coat from the corner. Okay, I whispered. We walked out of the manager's office. Gregory was pacing in the hall. When he saw us, he stopped dead, his eyes darting between me and Arvon. Mr. Bennett, is everything resolved? Gregory asked nervously. Perfectly, Arvon said smoothly. Ms. Hayes and I have concluded our business. She is leaving for the night. Leaving? But her shift is over, Arvon interrupted, his voice dropping an octave, and she will be paid in full for the evening. If I find out there is a single penalty docked from her agency file, Gregory, I will make sure elite event staffing never caters another event in this city. Am I understood? Gregory paled. He practically shrank against the wall. Yes, sir. Absolutely, sir. Arvon didn't wait for him to finish groveling. He placed a hand lightly on the small of my back, a surprisingly warm, grounding touch, and guided me down the hallway, away from the noise, away from the kitchen, and out the back exit toward the private loading docks. A sleek black car was idling in the alley, the engine a low purr. A driver in a dark suit immediately stepped out and opened the rear door. Arvon gestured for me to get in. I slid onto the leather seat, the smell of expensive conditioning masking the faint lingering scent of the kitchen's truffle oil on my clothes. I kept Levo secure in my lap. Arvan climbed in next to me. The door closed, shutting out the city noise. "Address?" the driver asked through the partition. I gave him my address. A run-down apartment complex on the edge of the industrial district. Not a place this car had ever been. The ride was quiet. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows. I expected Arvan to be on his phone, answering emails, doing whatever billionaires do in the back of luxury cars. But he just sat there, looking out the window, his hands resting loosely on his knees. As we pulled up to my building, a bleak brick monolith with flickering streetlights, I felt a wave of shame. I didn't want him to see this. I didn't want him to see the cracked pavement or the overflowing dumpster near the entrance. The car stopped. The driver opened the door. "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," I said, keeping my voice steady. "For everything. For the car and for Gregory." "Arvand," he corrected quietly. "Arvand. Thank you." I shifted to get out, careful not to wake Levo. "Holly." I stopped, looking back at him. "I meant what I said," Arvand said, the shadows of the car making his gray eyes look almost black. "About the weight." I swallowed the lump forming in my throat. "Good night, Arvand." I stepped out into the cold air. I didn't look back as I carried my sleeping son up the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment. I unlocked the deadbolt, laid Levo in his small bed, and finally, for the first time all night, I let out a long, shuddering breath. I thought that was the end of it. A bizarre Cinderella-adjacent story I would keep to myself, ending with a stained suit and a quiet car ride. I was wrong. That wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Saturday morning arrived with the metallic clanking of the building's ancient radiator. I woke up with a stiff neck, the previous night feeling like a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and truffle oil fumes. I rolled out of bed. The floorboards were freezing. I walked into the tiny kitchenette, pulled open the refrigerator, and stared at the reality I hadn't managed to escape. Half a carton of eggs, a heel of bread. The milk, as I had predicted, was down to its final 2 inches. There was no billionaire savior. Just me, the electric bill taped to the counter, and a 4-year-old who would be waking up hungry in 20 minutes. I put on the kettle. I tried to push Arvand Bennett out of my mind. Men like him were tourists in neighborhoods like this. They took a quick safari through the lives of the working poor to feel grounded, and then they retreated to their penthouses to wash the grit off their hands. He had paid for my cab ride. He had saved my job. We were even. Then somebody knocked on the door. It wasn't a tentative tap. It was a firm, deliberate rap of knuckles against the peeling veneer. I tightened my worn terry cloth robe around my waist and checked the peephole. My breath hitched. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Arvand Bennett stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. He wasn't wearing a $6,000 suit today. He wore a heavy navy fisherman's sweater, dark denim, and boots. He looked less like a tech titan and more like a man who chopped his own firewood. In his left hand, he carried a massive brown paper grocery bag. In his right, a cardboard carrier with 2 large coffees. "The front door to the building doesn't lock," he said by way of greeting. His brow was furrowed in disapproval. "Anyone can just walk in." "That's a feature, not a bug. It saves me from forgetting my keys," I shot back, crossing my arms. "What are you doing here, Arvand? You said the milk was almost gone." He hoisted the grocery bag slightly. I brought milk and coffee. Black for me, oat milk, and 1 sugar for you. I guessed on the sugar. I stared at him. The cynicism in my chest flared up, a protective wall snapping into place. Is this a charity drop? Do you have a photographer waiting on the stairs? He didn't flinch. He just held my gaze with those pale gray eyes. I don't do charity, Holly. I do investments. Can I come in? The hallway smells like boiled cabbage. I hesitated, then stepped aside. Arvan walked into my apartment. He seemed to take up all the oxygen in the tiny, cluttered living room. He set the groceries on the narrow counter and began pulling items out. Whole milk, fresh strawberries, a loaf of actual sourdough, not the plastic-wrapped slices I usually bought, real maple syrup. I don't know how to cook much, Arvan admitted, setting a carton of eggs next to the stove. But I can make pancakes, assuming you own a pan. Arvan, stop, I said. I walked over and put my hand on the counter, forcing him to look at me. You don't belong here. I appreciate what you did last night. I really do. But you're playing a game, and I don't have the energy for it. I have a kid to feed and a shift at 4 o'clock. I canceled my weekend. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. I was supposed to be in Aspen with 2 senators and a telecommunications CEO. I told my assistant I was sick. Why? Because I couldn't stop thinking about what you said in that office. He leaned against the cheap laminate counter. He looked incredibly vulnerable. I told you my house is silent. I realized I didn't want to go back to it. I wanted to be somewhere loud and real. Before I could answer, a door creaked open down the short hallway. Levo shuffled out, rubbing his eyes. He wore mismatched pajamas, his hair a riot of static electricity. He stopped in his tracks when he saw the giant man standing in our kitchen. Hi, Levo croaked, his voice thick with sleep. Good morning, Levo, Arvan said. He picked up the plastic fire truck from last night, which had ended up on the coffee table. He held it up. I brought back up for the fire truck. We're making pancakes, the messy kind. Levo's eyes widened. He looked at me for permission. I sighed, the fight draining out of me. The wall cracked just a fraction. Go wash your hands, Bug, I murmured. For the next 2 hours, my kitchen was a disaster zone. Arvan Bennett, a man who ruthlessly commanded boardrooms, was entirely out of his depth with pancake batter. He got flour on his sweater. He burned the first batch. Levo stood on a chair beside him, meticulously dropping single chocolate chips into the batter, bossing the billionaire around with the absolute authority only a 4-year-old possesses. I sat at the small kitchen table, drinking the coffee he brought, just watching them. Arvan didn't try to play the hero. He didn't offer to pay off my debts. He didn't promise to change my life. He just stood in my cramped kitchen, burning my breakfast, and asking Levo earnest questions about dinosaurs. Later, we walked to the neighborhood park. It was a far cry from the manicured green spaces of Arvan's zip code. The swing set creaked, the paint on the slide was chipping, and the sandbox was mostly dirt. Arvan pushed Levo on the swings. I sat on the cold metal bench, pulling my coat tight against the wind. After a while, Arvan left Levo building a dirt castle and came to sit beside me. Our shoulders brushed. The heat radiating off him was a stark contrast to the biting air. He's a good kid, Arvan said, watching Levo furiously digging with a plastic shovel. He's happy, despite the weight you carry. I try to keep the heavy stuff away from him, I said quietly. "You're doing a good job. It doesn't feel like it. Most days it feels like I'm bailing out a sinking rowboat with a teaspoon." Arvon turned his head to look at me. "Stop bailing for a minute. Let me help row." I swallowed hard, staring straight ahead at the rusted swing set. "Why? Why do you want to? You could have anyone." "I don't want anyone," he replied, his voice rough. "I'm 34 years old, Holly. I've spent a decade building an empire, and I'm realizing I built a fortress instead. I'm completely isolated. Everyone wants a piece of the company, or the money, or the influence. You." He let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "You looked at me like I was an inconvenience. You didn't care about the suit. You cared about your son." He reached out, his large warm hand covering my freezing fingers on the bench. "Let me take you to dinner on Tuesday," he said. "Just dinner. If you hate it, I'll walk away and you'll never see me again. I'll even pay for Mrs. Gable to watch him." I looked down at his hand covering mine. It felt terrifying. It felt like stepping off a ledge. "Mrs. Gable's wrist is broken," I whispered. "She can't watch him." "Then we'll bring him," Arvon said without missing a beat. "We'll go somewhere loud, somewhere with crayons." I finally looked at him. The cynical voice in my head was screaming to run, to protect myself, to stick to the survival routine I knew. But my heart, bruised and exhausted, wanted to rest. Just for a moment. "Okay," I said. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face, reaching those exhausted gray eyes and bringing them to life. 6 months is a blink in the grand scheme of a life, but it's enough time to completely rewrite a universe. I didn't quit my job. I refused to let Arvon pay my rent. We fought about it twice bitterly until he finally understood that my independence wasn't pride. It was survival. If the dream collapsed, I needed to know I could still stand on my own 2 feet. But he was there. He became the steady, quiet rhythm of our lives. He helped Levo build a lopsided birdhouse on my fire escape. He sat at my tiny kitchen table and reviewed my budgeting spreadsheets, teaching me how to aggressively negotiate my credit card interest rates. In return, I dragged him to loud, chaotic neighborhood street fairs and forced him to eat food from trucks that didn't have Michelin stars. The silence in his 8,000-square-foot penthouse slowly gave way to the noise of a 4-year-old. First, a stray Lego brick under the sofa. Then, a finger painting taped to the stainless steel refrigerator. Eventually, an entire room was converted into a playroom. It was a Tuesday evening in late November. The city outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of Arvon's apartment was a glittering blanket of sleet and traffic. I was in the kitchen chopping vegetables for a stew. It had become our routine. I cooked, he cleaned, we pretended the massive staff he employed didn't exist for the night. "Hey," I called out, wiping my hands on a dish towel. He dropped his briefcase by the door, loosened his tie, and let out a long breath. "The bid is dead. We won." "Thank God," I smiled, walking over to him. "You look dead on your feet." Before I could reach him, a blur of motion launched from the hallway. Levo. He was holding a sippy cup filled with dark purple grape juice, the lid of which, I suddenly realized with a spike of horror, I hadn't screwed on properly. "Arvon!" Levo yelled, thrilled his favorite person was home. Levo didn't slow down. He hit the slick hardwood floor in his socks, lost his footing, and went airborne. It happened in slow motion. The plastic cup hit Arvon squarely in the chest. The loose lid popped off. A geyser of sticky, dark purple juice exploded across the pristine lapel of the charcoal suit, cascading down the white dress shirt and soaking into the trousers. Levo hit the floor, skidding into Arvan's shins. Silence instantly choked the massive apartment. The muscle memory of poverty and panic is hard to break. My heart slammed against my ribs. I gasped, dropping the dish towel, the words spilling out of me automatically. "Oh my God, Arvan, I am so sorry," I breathed, rushing forward. "Levo, watch where you're going. Get up, get up. Arvan, don't move. I'll get club soda. I'll pay the dry cleaner." I was on my knees, frantically dabbing at his ruined trousers with the sleeves of my cheap sweater, exactly as I had done 6 months ago at the St. Regis. The fear was irrational now, but the instinct remained. Arvan's hand caught my wrist. His grip was firm, but gentle. I stopped, looking up at him, expecting to see the exhaustion finally curdle into anger. Instead, he was smiling. It wasn't a smirk. It was a soft, overwhelmingly tender smile. He looked down at his ruined, bespoke suit, and then he looked at me. "Holly," he said softly, "stop bailing the boat." He didn't pull me up. Instead, he dropped down, right there, into the puddle of sticky purple juice, ruining the knee of his trousers completely. He sank down until he was at eye level with Levo, who was sitting on the floor, looking terrified that he had broken the rules. Arvan reached out and ruffled Levo's hair. "It's just a suit, buddy. Don't worry about it." Then, still on his knees, Arvan shifted his gaze back to me. He reached into the inner pocket of his ruined jacket. He didn't pull out a handkerchief this time. He pulled out a small, dark velvet box. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. 6 months ago, Arvan said, his voice steady but thick with emotion, "You told me the hardest part of your day was waking up and putting the weight of the world back on your shoulders. You carried it all alone, to protect him." He glanced at Levo, then locked his gray eyes onto mine. "My world was empty, Holly. You and Levo. You brought the noise. You brought the mess. You brought the life." He took a deep breath. "I don't want the silence ever again." He turned slightly, shifting his focus fully to my 4-year-old son, who was watching with wide, curious eyes. "Levo," Arvan said, his voice dropping to a whisper that echoed in the quiet room. "I love your mom, more than anything, and I love you." Arvan swallowed hard, the ruthless CEO completely stripped away, leaving only a man asking for his life to begin. "Can I be your daddy?" Levo looked at the velvet box, then at Arvan. He blinked. "Do you have to wear a suit?" Arvan let out a wet, genuine laugh. "Not if I don't want to. No." Levo smiled, a bright, gap-toothed grin. He launched himself forward, throwing his arms around Arvan's neck, completely unbothered by the sticky grape juice. Arvan caught him, burying his face in Levo's shoulder for a long second. Then, he looked up at me over Levo's head. His eyes were shining. "Holly Hayes," he asked, the question laced with absolute certainty. "Will you marry me? Will you let me help carry the weight?" I looked at the billionaire kneeling in grape juice, holding my son like he was the most precious thing on earth. The cynical wall inside my chest didn't just crack, it shattered entirely. "Yes," I whispered, the tears finally spilling over. "Yes. We can share the weight." If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human, emotional stories every week. Don't forget to share this with someone who needs a reminder that love can be found in the most unexpected, messy moments of life. Drop a comment below with your favorite part of Holly and Arvan's journey. See you in the next video.